With his final silver dollar clutched in his calloused palm and starvation looming, Jedediah Morgan gambled everything on a collapsing stable that the whole town had written off as worthless. Blood, sweat, and bitter tears would transform that desperate purchase into something that would leave his enemies seething with rage and his doubters stunned into silence. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Jedediah Morgan had exactly $1 silver to his name when he first laid eyes on the abandoned stable. The September wind cut through his worn denim jacket, carrying the scent of sagebrush and coming rain. His bay-gelding Copper nudged his shoulder as if to say, "This is it." The horse had been his only companion for the past 3 years, ever since the ranch where he'd worked in Montana had gone under, forcing him to drift southward, taking odd jobs where he could find them. The stable stood alone on a stretch of forgotten prairie, its weathered boards silver gray against the endless golden grassland. Half the roof had collapsed, and one wall leaned precariously, as though the next strong wind might flatten it completely. But something about it called to Jed, perhaps because he recognized himself in its stubborn refusal to surrender completely to time and neglect. "What do you think, boy?" he murmured to Copper, who snorted softly and pawed at the ground. The horse's ribs weren't showing yet, but they would be soon if Jed didn't find steady work or a place to winter. October was approaching fast, and with it, the biting cold of the high plains. They couldn't keep sleeping under the stars much longer. Jed adjusted his hat against the glare of the afternoon sun and studied the structure more carefully. The foundation looked solid beneath the sagging timbers, and most of the corral fencing remained intact, though tangled with prairie grass and tumbleweeds. With work, a lot of work, it might be salvageable. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew his attention. A man on horseback approached, his gray stallion kicking up dust clouds. The rider reined in about 20 feet away, sizing up Jed with narrowed eyes. He was in his 60s, with a face weathered by sun and wind into deep creases, white hair showing beneath a battered Stetson. "You're trespassing," the man said without preamble. Jed touched the brim of his hat respectfully. Didn't know this land belonged to anyone. No fences marked, no signs posted. "Belongs to the bank now," the older man replied, his tone softening slightly. "Used to be part of my spread until the drought took most of my cattle 3 years back. Name's Ellis Hargrove." "Jedediah Morgan," Jed offered. "This your stable?" "Was. Built it myself 30 years ago." Pain flashed across Ellis's face. "Bank foreclosed on most of my land last spring, but they don't care about this old wreck. Too far from the main ranch to be worth anything to them." Jed looked back at the stable, seeing it with new eyes, not just abandoned but forsaken, a monument to someone's broken dreams. "What would they take for it?" Ellis barked a laugh. "Son, you look like you haven't got 2 nickels to rub together." "Got this," Jed said, fishing the silver dollar from his pocket. It gleamed in the sunlight, his last worldly possession besides Copper and the clothes on his back. He'd been saving it for an emergency, but something told him this decrepit stable represented his last chance to stop drifting. Ellis studied him for a long moment. $1 for a falling down stable on 5 acres of hardscrabble prairie. You'd be throwing your money away. Maybe. Jed ran his hand along Copper's neck, feeling the horse's warmth beneath his palm. Or maybe not. Something in Ellis's expression shifted. He dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose joints protested such actions, then approached Jed with an appraising look. "Why this place?" he asked. "Plenty of towns between here and Denver where a young man might find proper work." Jed considered the question. The truth was he'd had his fill of taking orders from men who saw him as nothing more than another hired hand, expendable when times got tough. He'd watched his father work himself to death on another man's ranch with nothing to show for a lifetime of labor. "I'm tired of working other men's dreams," he said finally. "Figured it's time to build something of my own, even if it's nothing but a patched-up stable." Ellis nodded slowly. "Bank won't even bother with paperwork for $1, but I know the manager. I could put in a word, tell him I'm selling you this parcel direct. He might agree just to get it off their books." Hope, an unfamiliar sensation, bloomed in Jed's chest. "I'd be obliged." "Don't thank me yet," Ellis warned. "Winter's coming and that roof won't keep out a light dew, let alone snow. You got tools? Supplies?" "Got these." Jed held up his hands, calloused and strong from years of ranch work. Ellis shook his head, but there was grudging respect in his eyes. "Well, you've got grit, I'll give you that. Come on back to my place. We'll talk to the bank tomorrow." That night, Jed slept in Ellis's barn, the first roof over his head in weeks. The older man's ranch house stood a mile east of the abandoned stable, much reduced from its former glory but still functioning. Over a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Ellis shared the stable's history. "Built it for my son," he explained, staring into his coffee cup. "He had dreams of breeding quarter horses, had an eye for good bloodlines." The past tense told Jed everything he needed to know, and he didn't press for details. The next morning they rode to town together. The bank manager, a thin man named Grayson with suspicious eyes, examined Jed's silver dollar as if expecting it to be counterfeit. 5 acres of worthless land and a collapsing stable, he mused, making a note in his ledger. "Hargrove, you're doing us a favor taking this off our inventory, even for $1. Ellis grunted. "Just make it legal and proper. Boy deserves a fair chance." An hour later, Jed had a crudely drawn deed and empty pockets, but for the first time in his adult life he owned something that couldn't be taken away. As they rode back, Ellis pointed out the boundaries of Jed's new property, marked by a lightning-struck oak to the north and a dry creek bed to the south. "Previous owner before me said there's a spring on that land," Ellis mentioned casually. "Dried up years ago, but who knows? Might still be there underground." Jed nodded, filing away the information. Water would make all the difference between survival and prosperity. They parted ways at the stable, his stable now. Ellis hesitated, then reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a worn hammer. "First rule of ranching," he said, handing it to Jed. "Always help a neighbor get started, 'cause someday you'll be the one needing help." He touched his hat brim. "Good luck, Morgan. You're gonna need it." Jed watched Ellis ride away, then turned to face his purchase. In the late afternoon light, the stable looked even more dilapidated, a fool's investment if ever there was one. "Well, Copper," he said to the horse, who was already nosing around the corral area, "we're home." The word felt strange on his tongue. Home. He hadn't had one of those since he was 17. With the hammer in his hand and the deed in his pocket, Jed took his first step toward the stable. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled. Storm coming. Time to get to work. The rain came with a vengeance that first night, exposing every gap in the stable's roof. Jed huddled with Copper in the driest corner, both of them soaked by morning. As the first light of dawn crept through the holes in the walls, Jed surveyed his purchase with clearer eyes. What had seemed merely dilapidated yesterday now appeared nearly beyond salvation. "We've made worse decisions," he told Copper, who snorted skeptically. The horse was right. This might actually be the worst decision of his 32 years. Standing ankle-deep in mud, Jed made a mental inventory of what needed immediate attention, the roof first, then the north wall that was listing dangerously. The corral fencing could wait. Copper wasn't going anywhere in this weather. He started by scavenging. The collapsed portion of the roof had splintered into usable planks. Some of the support beams were still solid, and rusty nails could be straightened and reused. By midday, he had assembled a modest pile of materials, though not nearly enough. Ellis appeared around noon, leading a mule loaded with supplies: tar paper, a box of nails, rope, and a worn tarp. "Figured you could use these," he said gruffly, dismounting with a grunt. "Left over from when I patched my own roof last spring." Jed swallowed his pride. A man with nothing couldn't afford to refuse help. "Much obliged." Together they stretched the tarp over the most damaged section of the roof, securing it with rope. It wasn't pretty, but it would keep the rain out until Jed could make proper repairs. "Found anything interesting?" Ellis asked as they worked. "Like what?" The older man shrugged. Previous owner was odd, secretive type. Always thought he might have hidden something valuable before the bank took his place. "Haven't seen anything but rotting wood and mouse nests," Jed replied, though the comment piqued his curiosity. With the tarp secured, Ellis helped him brace the leaning wall with salvaged lumber. The work was exhausting, but by late afternoon the stable looked marginally less likely to collapse. When Ellis departed, he left behind the remaining supplies and a sack of beans and cornmeal, just until you get on your feet. Alone again, Jed built a small fire outside the stable. As darkness fell, he studied his new home by firelight. Despite the day's improvements, it remained a sorry sight. But it was his. The next week passed in a blur of labor from dawn to dusk. Jed prioritized structural repairs, working methodically to stabilize the building. He fashioned crude tools from scrap metal and stones, using techniques he'd learned during lean years when replacement parts for ranch equipment were unaffordable luxuries. On the fifth day, while digging post holes to reinforce the foundation, his shovel struck something metallic. Kneeling in the dirt, he unearthed an old tin box. Its lid rusted shut. He pried it open with his knife to find a cache of silver dollars, 26 in all, wrapped in oilcloth. Jed sat back on his heels, staring at the unexpected treasure. This was more money than he'd held at once in years, enough to buy proper building materials in town, maybe even some livestock come spring. The previous owner's hidden emergency fund, forgotten in his haste to abandon the failing property. He considered keeping the discovery to himself, but found he couldn't. The next time Ellis visited, bringing a sack of potatoes and news from town, Jed showed him the box. "Well, I'll be damned," Ellis said, examining one of the coins. Old Jacob Harrison always was the type to keep his money close instead of in a bank. Ironic considering how things ended for him. "Is there family I should return this to?" Jed asked. Ellis shook his head. "Jacob died alone 3 years back. No kin ever came forward." He pushed the box back toward Jed. "It's yours now, fair and square. Found on your property." The silver dollars transformed Jed's prospects. He purchased lumber, proper tools, and glass for windows from the general store in town. The shopkeeper, initially suspicious of the trail-worn cowboy, became markedly friendlier when Jed paid with silver and mentioned he was fixing up the old Harrison place. Word spread quickly in the small community. A man named Tucker, who ran the livery stable, stopped by with a broken wagon wheel he claimed to have no use for. "Thought you might salvage the iron," he said casually, though the wheel was perfectly repairable. The blacksmith's widow, Mrs. Holloway, appeared with her teenage son and a basket of fresh bread. "Just being neighborly," she insisted, though her eyes assessed both Jed and the improving stable with undisguised interest. Her son, a gangly boy named Thomas, offered to help with repairs. Jed accepted gratefully, finding the boy had a natural talent for carpentry. As October progressed, the stable began to resemble a proper structure again. Jed replaced rotted support beams, patched the roof with new shingles, and rebuilt the most damaged wall. With Thomas's help, he installed windows salvaged from an abandoned homestead 3 miles east, letting light into the dark interior. But Jed's most significant discovery came when searching for a suitable location to dig a well. Following Ellis's mention of a spring, he surveyed the lower portion of his 5 acres looking for signs of underground water. In a shallow depression ringed by unusually green grass, the ground felt spongier underfoot. Digging down 4 feet, his shovel broke through to a pocket of water, not abundant but clear and sweet. The discovery of water changed everything. A property with a reliable water source, even a modest one, had real value on the plains. That evening, sitting by his fire and watching stars appear above the now sturdy roof of his stable, Jed allowed himself to envision a future. With water, he could plant a small garden come spring. The corral, once properly rebuilt, could hold more than just copper. Perhaps a few cattle or even the quarter horses that Jacob Harrison's son had dreamed of breeding. For the first time since leaving Montana, Jed felt the stirring of something like hope. Not just the desperate hope of survival, but the expanding hope of possibility. Ellis found him there, contemplating the fire, and settled his aging bones on a nearby stump. "Place is looking better," he observed, accepting the cup of coffee Jed offered. "Might actually survive the winter now." "Found water too," Jed told him. "Small spring, but it's flowing." Ellis nodded appreciatively. "That's fortune smiling on you." He hesitated, then added, "Brings me to why I came by. Got a proposition for you." Jed waited, sensing the older man's uncharacteristic uncertainty. "Bank's foreclosing on my last 40 acres come November unless I can make payment," Ellis finally said. "Got no cash, but I've still got 12 head of cattle. Good stock, worth more than I owe. But no buyers this time of year." He took a breath. "I thought maybe we could help each other out." As stars brightened overhead and the repaired stable stood solid against the gathering darkness, Jed listened to a proposition that would change the course of his life and the fate of his $1 investment forever. "I've got 12 head of cattle, but nowhere to keep them once the bank takes my place," Ellis explained, his weathered face illuminated by the dancing flames. "You've got land with water and a stable that's coming along, but no livestock." Jed nodded slowly, understanding dawning. "You're suggesting a partnership?" "More of an arrangement," Ellis clarified. "I'd bring my cattle here. We'd split the calves come spring. You'd have the start of your own herd without laying out cash, and I'd still have something to my name after the bank's done with me." It was a generous offer, more generous than Ellis was letting on. 12 head of cattle represented the old rancher's last worldly possessions, the remnant of what had once been a prosperous operation. Entrusting them to a drifter he'd known for barely 2 weeks spoke of either desperation or an uncanny faith in Jed's character. "What makes you think I won't just sell them and disappear?" Jed asked bluntly. Ellis's laugh was dry as prairie dust. "Son, if you were the type to steal, you'd have kept quiet about those silver dollars. Besides, a man planning to run doesn't work himself to the bone fixing a place like this." He gestured at the stable. "You're putting down roots, whether you meant to or not." Jed stared into the fire, weighing the proposition. Cattle required feed, care, protection from rustlers and predators. His 5 acres wouldn't sustain 12 head for long. They'd need to graze elsewhere. But with Ellis's knowledge of the local range and Jed's willingness to work, it might be possible. "I accept," he said finally, extending his hand. "Partners." They sealed the deal with a handshake, and Ellis departed, promising to return with the cattle before the first snow. The following days took on new urgency. A cattle operation, even a modest one, required infrastructure beyond a patched-up stable. Jed threw himself into building a proper corral and a lean-to shelter where the animals could find protection from winter storms. Thomas Holloway continued to help, working for meals and the occasional silver coin, bringing news and gossip from town. "Ma says you're the talk of Preston's Crossing," the boy reported as they repaired fencing. Everyone's wondering about the stranger who bought Harrison's old place. What are they saying? Jed asked, hammering a post into the ground. Thomas grinned. Mr. Grayson at the bank thinks you're a fool. Reverend Simmons says you're an example of frontier spirit. Tucker down at the livery is taking bets on how long you'll last. And what does your mother say? The boy's face reddened slightly. She says it's about time a man with ambition came to these parts. Jed kept his expression neutral, though the comment unsettled him. He'd noticed Mrs. Holloway's increasing visits, always with some small gift or offer of assistance. She was comely enough and certainly capable, running the blacksmith shop since her husband's death 2 years prior. But Jed wasn't looking for attachments beyond his business arrangement with Ellis. The proposition of partnership had changed his calculations entirely. Before, he'd been focused on creating a humble shelter for himself and Copper. Now he was preparing for a legitimate ranching operation, albeit a small one. His silver dollars dwindled as he purchased necessities, fencing wire, salt blocks, basic veterinary supplies. Ellis visited regularly, bringing tools and advice. Together, they rode the surrounding countryside, the older man pointing out water sources and sheltered valleys where cattle might find forage during winter storms. Though the majority of Ellis's former ranch had been foreclosed upon, he knew every draw and gulch for miles around, knowledge as valuable as gold to a cattleman. This land's better than folks give it credit for, Ellis said as they paused atop a ridge overlooking a vast stretch of prairie. Good grass when the rains come, plenty of natural shelter. Problem is, it takes patience to learn its ways, and most men run out of money before they run out of patience. Late October brought the first hard frost, silvering the grass and stiffening the mud around Jed's stable into concrete-like hardness. The structure now stood solid and weather-tight, its roof properly shingled, walls reinforced, and floor swept clean of years of debris. Adjacent to it, a substantial corral awaited its inhabitants, and a small shed held winter feed, hay purchased from a neighboring rancher with the last of Jed's silver dollars. The night before Ellis was due to arrive with the cattle, an unexpected visitor appeared at Jed's door. Grayson, the bank manager, accompanied by the town marshal. "Mr. Morgan," Grayson began without preamble, "I understand you've entered into a business arrangement with Ellis Hargrove." Jed leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. "That's right. I feel obliged to warn you that Mr. Hargrove's cattle are encumbered assets. The bank has a claim on them as part of our foreclosure proceedings." "That's so?" Jed kept his voice neutral despite the sinking feeling in his stomach. "Ellis seems to think differently." The marshal, a taciturn man named Wallace, whom Jed had met briefly in town, shifted uncomfortably. "Bank's got the paperwork, Morgan. If those cattle come onto your property, they're still subject to seizure." Jed considered his options. Refusing Ellis now would condemn the old rancher to complete destitution, but accepting the cattle might entangle him in legal troubles he couldn't afford. "I appreciate the warning," he said finally. "Now, if you gentlemen don't mind, I've got work to finish before dark." After they departed, Jed sat by his fire long into the night, contemplating this new complication. By legal rights, perhaps the bank did have a claim on Ellis's cattle, but there was something that didn't sit right about Grayson's eagerness to foreclose on a man who'd worked this land for decades. At dawn, Jed rode out to intercept Ellis, finding the old rancher driving his small herd along the creek bed that marked the property's southern boundary. The cattle, a mix of Herefords and Longhorns, moved steadily through the morning mist, their breath forming clouds in the chill air. "Grayson paid me a visit last night," Jed said without preamble. "Claims the bank has rights to these cattle." Ellis's face hardened. Figured he might try something like that. The mortgage is on the land, not the livestock. He knows it, but he's counting on no one checking the fine print. "You sure about that?" Ellis reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "My original loan agreement. Read it yourself. No mention of cattle or movable property as collateral. Jed scanned the paper, recognizing the validity of Ellis's claim. The bank's reach extended only to the land itself, not to personal property or livestock. So Grayson's bluffing, Jed concluded. He's hoping I'll give up without a fight, Ellis confirmed, tucking the document away. Been trying to get his hands on my breeding stock for years. He fixed Jed with a steady gaze. Question is, are you still in? The sun broke through the morning mist, illuminating the small herd, the beginning of something that could grow, that could transform 5 acres and a renovated stable into a genuine ranch. Jed made his decision. Let's get these cattle home, he said. The cattle settled into their new home with surprising ease. Ellis had trained them well, and they seemed to sense the sheltered corner of Jed's property was a safe haven. The small herd, 8 cows, 3 heifers approaching breeding age, and 1 massive Hereford bull Ellis called Emperor, represented the foundation of what both men hoped would become a profitable venture. Emperor's bloodline goes back to stock I brought from Kentucky, Ellis explained proudly as the bull claimed the best spot in the corral. His calves fetch top dollar at market, strong and hardy, built for this climate. The arrival of the cattle transformed Jed's humble homestead into a working ranch. Suddenly his days had structure beyond repair work, feeding, watering, checking for illness or injury. The responsibilities were familiar from his years as a hired hand, but the sense of ownership was entirely new. These animals weren't just in his care, their futures were tied to his own. Word of the arrangement spread quickly through Preston's Crossing. Jed found himself receiving more visitors, some genuinely neighborly, others clearly curious about the partnership that had Grayson fuming at the bank. He's convinced you and Ellis are trying to defraud his institution, Mrs. Holloway reported while delivering a fresh-baked pie. Her visits had become regular, always with some small offering of food or useful household items. Says he's considering legal action. Nothing fraudulent about our arrangement, Jed replied, accepting the pie with thanks. Ellis's loan document is clear. The bank has no claim on his livestock. Perhaps, but Grayson holds considerable influence in these parts. He's the type to hold grudges. She hesitated, then added, You might want to consider strengthening your position in the community. The suggestion wasn't subtle. A bachelor rancher was vulnerable in ways a married man with family connections was not. Mrs. Holloway, a widow of 2 years with a thriving blacksmith business, represented a logical alliance. Jed merely nodded non-committally and changed the subject. November brought the first significant snowfall, transforming the landscape into a rolling sea of white. The repairs to the stable proved their worth as the structure held firm against howling winds. Inside, Copper shared space with Emperor, the 2 males establishing an uneasy truce, while the cattle huddled in the lean-to shelter, protected from the worst of the elements. Ellis moved into the small room Jed had partitioned off in one corner of the stable. With his own property now officially in the bank's possession, the old rancher had nowhere else to go. He brought few possessions, some clothes, tools, a Winchester rifle that had been his father's, and a locked trunk he kept beneath his cot. Family papers, he explained gruffly when he caught Jed looking at it. Nothing valuable, just memories. Together they established a rhythm through the early winter weeks. Jed handled the physical labor, breaking ice from water troughs, distributing hay, reinforcing fences damaged by snow and wind. Ellis contributed his extensive knowledge of cattle, teaching Jed the subtle signs of health problems and the techniques for helping animals survive the harsh winter conditions. Never seen a man take to ranching so natural, Ellis commented one evening as they thawed frozen fingers by the stove. Some men work cattle their whole lives without developing the instincts you've shown in weeks. Had good teachers over the years, Jed replied, though the praise warmed him more than he let on. December brought challenges beyond weather. 2 of the cows developed respiratory ailments that required constant attention. Jed spent nights in the stable, applying poultices Ellis prepared and ensuring the animals remained warm and hydrated. They lost 1 heifer despite their efforts, a blow that hit both men hard, but strengthened their resolve to see the others through winter. Food supplies dwindled faster than anticipated with 2 men to feed. Game was scarce, and travel to town became difficult as snow drifted across the trails. They rationed carefully, supplementing with whatever Jed could hunt in the surrounding hills. Christmas approached with little fanfare until Thomas Holloway appeared on their doorstep, half frozen from his journey through the snow, bearing gifts from town, coffee, sugar, tobacco, and letters forwarded from the postmaster. "Ma wanted to come herself," Thomas explained, stomping snow from his boots, "but the passes are nearly impassable. Marshal Wallace asked me to deliver this too." He handed Jed an official-looking envelope. Inside was a notice from the county court, summoning both Jed and Ellis to appear in January regarding Grayson's petition to inspect and potentially seize the cattle as bank property. "He doesn't give up easy," Ellis muttered after reading the document. "Even with my loan papers, he's found a judge willing to hear his case." Jed studied the summons, unsurprised but concerned. "We'll need someone who understands the law better than we do. Lawyer in Sterling might help, but that's 30 miles in winter conditions and he'll want payment up front." They sat in troubled silence until Thomas spoke up. "Mr. Davis at the general store used to practice law back east before his lungs forced him to seek drier climate. He might advise you, especially if you mention my mother's name." The suggestion revealed more about Mrs. Holloway's interest than Thomas probably intended. Jed filed the information away, thanked the boy, and sent him home with a small pouch of coffee beans as a return gift. New Year's Day dawned clear and bitterly cold. Jed rose before sunrise as usual, only to find Ellis already outside, examining the spring Jed had discovered months earlier. "Been thinking about our water situation," Ellis said without preamble. "This spring's flow has strengthened since you cleared it. With some work, we could divert it to irrigate 10 acres come summer." The casual mention of summer struck Jed forcefully. Until now, their partnership had focused on immediate survival. Planning for planting season suggested a permanence neither had openly acknowledged. "That would mean expanding beyond my 5 acres, Jed noted. Ellis nodded. "Adjacent 40 acres reverts to public domain in February if no one claims it. Land office would grant homestead rights to anyone showing improvements and intent to farm." "You've been making plans." "Just considering possibilities," Ellis replied with a shrug that didn't quite disguise his enthusiasm. "This spring changes everything. Water rights in this territory are worth their weight in gold." Before Jed could respond, hoofbeats announced visitors, Marshal Wallace and 2 deputies, approaching through the morning mist. "That court date's not for 3 weeks, Ellis growled, straightening his aging frame. "This isn't about the court order," Jed said quietly, recognizing the grim set of Wallace's jaw. "Something's happened." The marshal reined in his horse, breath clouding in the frigid air. "Morgan Hargrove," he acknowledged with a nod. "Afraid I've got bad news from town." As the sun broke over the eastern horizon, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground, Jed braced himself for whatever new challenge was about to test his $1 investment and the future he was beginning to envision for himself in this harsh but promising land. Marshal Wallace dismounted, brushing snow from his heavy coat. "There was a fire in town last night. Started in the bank and spread to adjacent buildings." "Anyone hurt?" Jed asked, immediately concerned. "No casualties, thank the Lord. Folks got out in time." Wallace stomped his boots against the cold. "Mind if we come inside? This news is best delivered somewhere warm." Inside the stable's makeshift living quarters, Wallace and his deputies thawed their hands by the stove while Ellis poured coffee. The marshal's expression remained grave. "Here's the troubling part," he continued. "Bank vault was open when the fire started. Grayson claims someone broke in, stole documents, then set the blaze to cover their tracks." His eyes moved deliberately between Jed and Ellis. "Given your recent troubles with the bank, you understand why I'm here." Ellis slammed his cup down, sloshing coffee. "You think we rode 15 miles in a blizzard, broke into the bank, then risked our necks setting a fire? For what? To destroy papers that I already have copies of?" "I'm just following procedure," Wallace replied evenly. "Where were you both last night between midnight and 3? "Right here," Jed answered. "One of our heifers was calving early. We were up all night with her." He gestured toward the stall where a newborn calf now nursed, its mother looking exhausted but healthy. The deputies examined the calf, confirming it couldn't be more than hours old. Wallace nodded, seemingly satisfied. "I believed as much but needed to check officially." Grayson was insistent. "Of course he was," Ellis muttered. After checking their horses and the rest of the cattle, the lawman prepared to leave. At the door, Wallace held back, speaking quietly to Jed alone. "Off the record, Morgan, Grayson's been talking all over town about taking these cattle, legal or not. Says they represent assets the bank's entitled to." He adjusted his hat. "I'd keep a close watch, especially at night." When the lawman departed, Ellis settled heavily into a chair, suddenly looking every year of his age. This fire changes things. Bank records destroyed means Grayson will push harder to seize anything he can claim as collateral. "You think he started it himself?" Jed asked. "Wouldn't put it past him. Man's desperate. His quarterly review with the regional manager is coming, and he's got too many bad loans on his books. Our cattle would help his balance sheet considerably." Ellis stared into his coffee. "We need that lawyer from Sterling." Jed nodded. "I'll ride out tomorrow if the weather clears." "Take Emperor with you," Ellis suggested. "Someone in Sterling might recognize his bloodline. Could be worth something if we need to negotiate." The following morning dawned clear but bitterly cold. Jed set out at first light, leaving Ellis with the Winchester and strict instructions to fire 3 shots if trouble appeared. The journey to Sterling was punishing. 30 miles across snow-covered prairie with temperatures well below freezing. Emperor, tethered behind Copper, trudged stoically through drifts that sometimes reached his massive chest. Sterling proved larger than Preston's Crossing, a proper town with brick buildings and even a small hotel. Jed located the lawyer's office near the courthouse, a modest establishment with Bernard Holcomb, attorney, painted on the frosted glass door. Holcomb himself was a surprise, younger than expected, barely 30, with wire-rimmed spectacles and an Eastern accent. He listened intently as Jed explained their situation. "Technically, Mr. Hargrove's position is sound," Holcomb confirmed after reviewing the loan documents Jed had brought. "Livestock wasn't collateral in the original mortgage, but with bank records destroyed, Grayson might claim the actual agreement was different from what your copies show. So we need the judge to recognize our documentation as legitimate." "Precisely, and character witnesses would help. Respected community members willing to vouch for Mr. Hargrove's integrity." Holcomb leaned forward. "Do you have anyone like that?" Jed thought of Mrs. Holloway, Thomas, Tucker from the livery, people who'd shown kindness, if not exactly friendship. "Perhaps," he answered cautiously. "Good. Now, about my fee," Holcomb began, but was interrupted by a knock. A stable boy entered, looking excited. "Pardon, sir, but is that Emperor out front? Old Jacob Harrison's prize bull?" Holcomb raised an eyebrow. "You know this animal?" "Everyone in cattle country knows Emperor," the boy exclaimed. "Won the territorial fair 3 years running before Harrison lost his place. They say his bloodline goes back to Kentucky champion stock." Jed watched Holcomb's expression change, legal calculations clearly spinning behind those spectacles. The lawyer dismissed the boy with a coin, then turned back to Jed with newfound interest. "Mr. Morgan, I believe we can work out an arrangement regarding my fee, and I'd like to see your operation firsthand when we prepare for court." The return journey proved even more harrowing than the outbound trip. A front moved in, bringing wind-driven snow that reduced visibility to mere feet. Jed relied on Copper's instincts more than his own sense of direction. Emperor followed dutifully, his massive form breaking trail through deepening drifts. They were still 5 miles from home when Jed spotted the glow on the horizon, orange light reflecting off low clouds in a way that could only mean one thing: fire. Terror seized him as he urged Copper forward. The gelding, sensing his rider's desperation, summoned reserves of energy despite the grueling conditions. Even Emperor seemed to understand the urgency, following without resistance. As they crested the final rise, Jed's worst fears were confirmed. Flames engulfed the stable, shooting skyward and casting writhing shadows across the snow-covered ground. The cattle huddled at the far end of the property, away from the inferno. Jed's heart hammered as he searched desperately for signs of Ellis. Had the old man escaped? Was he trying to save what he could from the flames? Then movement caught his eye. 3 riders departing northward at speed. Even at a distance, Jed recognized the lead figure's distinctive silhouette, Grayson. Rage replaced fear as Jed understood. This was no accident, no random misfortune. This was deliberate destruction, a message delivered in the most devastating way possible: surrender the cattle or lose everything. He was still a quarter-mile away when a portion of the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning timber. The sound carried across the frozen landscape like the death knell of his dreams. The stable, his home, his investment, the foundation of his new life, was beyond saving. As he drew nearer, a figure emerged from behind the corral. Ellis, rifle in hand, limping but alive. Relief flooded Jed, followed immediately by grim determination. They had survived, which meant this wasn't the end. Dismounting, Jed surveyed the destruction. The stable was a total loss, along with nearly everything inside. The corral was damaged but repairable. The cattle were unharmed, though clearly agitated. "They came at dusk," Ellis reported, voice rough from smoke. 6 men masked. I got a shot off, winged one of them, but they overpowered me. He gestured to a bloody gash on his temple. "When I came to, they doused the place with coal oil and lit it up." "Grayson," Jed said, the name like acid on his tongue. Ellis nodded. "Leading the pack. Didn't even bother hiding his face." Around them, the wind howled across the snowy plain, driving bitter cold that contrasted cruelly with the heat of the burning stable. Everything Jed had built with his silver-dollar investment now lay in smoldering ruins. But as Emperor trudged to rejoin his herd, and Copper pressed against Jed's shoulder in silent comfort, a strange calm settled over him. The stable was gone, but the spring still flowed beneath the snow. The land remained. Most importantly, his cattle, their cattle, were safe. The night after the fire, Jed and Ellis sheltered in a shallow cave in the hillside, taking turns tending a small fire and watching over the cattle. Dawn revealed the full extent of the destruction. The stable was nothing but charred timbers and ash, the corral half destroyed, and their meager possessions reduced to cinders. "My deed," Jed said suddenly, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "It was inside." "No matter," Ellis replied, his face grim but composed. "Land records are filed with the county. Grayson knows that. This wasn't about destroying your claim, it was about breaking your spirit." Jed surveyed the blackened remains of his home, his $1 investment now seemingly worthless. But beneath the despair, something hardened within him, a determination that surprised even himself. "He failed," Jed said simply. They spent that first day securing the livestock and salvaging what little they could from the ruins. Ellis's trunk had survived, protected by its metal construction and position against the stone foundation. Inside, among family papers and photographs, they discovered something unexpected. Architectural drawings for a ranch house and barn, professionally rendered and carefully preserved. "My son's plans," Ellis explained, handling the papers reverently. "He studied architecture back east before coming home to help run the ranch. Always wanted to build something that would last generations." The old man's voice faltered. Influenza took him before he could start building. Jed studied the detailed drawings, impressed by their precision and practical design. "These are good, really good." "Keep them," Ellis said abruptly, pushing the plans toward Jed. "I'm too old to build dreams. Maybe you aren't." The gesture moved Jed deeply, though he carefully maintained his composure. These drawings represented not just buildings, but the transfer of hope from one generation to another, from Ellis's son to Jed, a drifter who'd stumbled into putting down roots. Their immediate concern, however, was shelter. Using salvaged wood and canvas from Ellis's saddle packs, they constructed a crude lean-to against a natural rock formation. It wouldn't suffice for long, but it would keep them alive until they could rebuild. The second day brought unexpected allies. Thomas Holloway appeared with his mother and 3 other men from town, all carrying tools and supplies. "Heard about the fire?" Mrs. Holloway said briskly, organizing the men to unload a wagon laden with lumber, canvas, and food. "Preston's Crossing takes care of its own." "I'm hardly one of your own," Jed pointed out. "Been here less than 3 months." She fixed him with a direct gaze. "You became one of us when you chose to put down roots here. Besides, everyone knows Grayson was behind this and folks are tired of his bullying." By sundown, they had erected a substantial tent and the beginnings of a proper shelter for the cattle. The visitors departed with promises to return the following day with more assistance. "You've made an impression," Ellis observed after they left. "Especially on the widow Holloway." Jed ignored the implication. "These people have their own hardships. Why help us? Frontier folk understand something city people often forget. Today it's your barn burning, tomorrow it might be mine. We help each other, or we all perish." As promised, help continued to arrive over subsequent days. Tucker from the livery brought 2 young horses, to replace what you lost in the fire, he claimed, though Jed suspected they were payment for past gambling debts to Ellis. Reverend Simmons organized a group of church members to help construct a temporary cabin that would see them through winter. Even the general store owner Davis contributed supplies on credit, with a whispered assurance that Grayson's days in this town are numbered. A week after the fire, lawyer Holcomb arrived from Sterling, having heard about the incident. He surveyed the destruction with professional detachment, then laid out their options. "Arson is a hanging offense in this territory," he explained. "But without witnesses willing to testify against Grayson specifically, it's your word against his." "We could identify his companions," Jed suggested. "His associates will have alibis established by now," Holcomb countered. "However, this incident strengthens our case regarding the cattle. A judge will look unfavorably on a banker who resorts to intimidation tactics." The attorney promised to expedite their court date and departed, leaving Jed and Ellis to continue their rebuilding efforts. Progress was steady but slow. The temporary cabin took shape, a single room with a stone fireplace built into the hillside for added protection from winter storms. January brought record cold and another challenge. Feed for the cattle began running dangerously low. With their stored hay lost in the fire, they were forced to supplement with expensive feed purchased from neighboring ranchers. Jed's remaining silver dollars dwindled rapidly. "We could sell a heifer," Ellis suggested reluctantly one evening as they calculated their dwindling resources. "No," Jed replied firmly. "The herd stays intact. We'll find another way." The solution came from an unexpected quarter. Marshal Wallace arrived the following day, ostensibly checking on their progress but carrying news of particular interest. Railroad survey crews setting up camp 10 miles west, he mentioned casually. Paying good wages for experienced horsemen to scout the territory ahead. Dangerous work, though. Apache have been spotted in those parts. Jed understood the unspoken opportunity. Such work would pay enough to see them through until spring, but would require leaving Ellis alone to manage the cattle. "I can handle things here," the older man insisted when Jed expressed concern. "Done it for 40 years before you showed up." "And if Grayson returns?" Ellis patted the Winchester. "Let him try. Besides, Mrs. Holloway's boy has offered to help while you're gone. Smart lad, good with animals." The decision made, Jed prepared for departure. The railroad job would last 3 weeks at most, enough time to earn what they needed without abandoning their homestead for too long. The night before Jed was to leave, Ellis unsealed a package he'd been holding since the fire, a bundle wrapped in oilcloth that had survived in his metal trunk. "Found this among my son's effects after he passed," he explained, unwrapping a beautifully crafted Colt revolver with pearl grips. "Never had the heart to sell it, though God knows I needed the money at times." He handed the weapon to Jed. "Railroad work is dangerous. Take this." Jed accepted the gift, recognizing the significance of the gesture. "I'll return it when I come back." "See that you do," Ellis replied gruffly. "And come back in one piece. We've got a court date to keep and a ranch to build." At dawn, Jed mounted Copper, the pearl-handled Colt secure in his holster, and took a final look at what remained of his $1 investment: a half-built cabin, a damaged corral, a small herd of cattle, and an old man who had become more than a business partner. 3 weeks, he promised. Then we finish what we started. As he rode westward toward the railroad camp, Jed carried with him not just Ellis's gun and trust, but the architectural drawings that represented a future neither man had dared imagine when they first struck their bargain, a future that Grayson's fire had failed to destroy and had perhaps, ironically, only strengthened their resolve to build. The railroad survey camp sprawled across a flat stretch of prairie, a collection of canvas tents and makeshift corrals housing 30 men and twice as many horses. Jed reported to the foreman, a battle-scarred veteran named Harkins, who sized him up with practiced efficiency. "Ever worked railroad before, Road?" Harkins demanded, not bothering with pleasantries. "No, but I've ridden this territory for years," Jed replied, the lie coming easily. He needed this job too badly for complete honesty. "You'll be scouting ahead of the main survey party," Harkins explained, marking positions on a crude map. "Need to know the lay of the land, water sources, potential trouble, both natural and human." His finger tapped a section of the map marked with hatched lines. "Apache hunting grounds here. They don't appreciate visitors." The pay was better than Jed had hoped, $5 a day plus meals, with a $10 bonus for identifying usable water sources. If he could last the full 3 weeks, he'd return to Ellis with enough money to see them through until spring and fund the beginning of a proper rebuilding effort. He was paired with a scout named Delaney, a wiry Irishman with quick eyes and a quicker tongue. "You're the fellow with the burned-out ranch," Delaney remarked as they rode out on their first assignment. "Word travels. They say the bank man tried to run you off." "Something like that," Jed acknowledged, wary of sharing too much. "Banks," Delaney spat. "Worse than highway robbers. At least a proper thief has the decency to face you when he takes your money." Their assignment was straightforward: ride 10 miles ahead of the survey team, mapping terrain and identifying obstacles that might affect the planned railroad route. The work was physically demanding but familiar to anyone accustomed to long days in the saddle. Copper performed admirably, his endurance and sure-footedness proving valuable on the rugged terrain, By the third day, Jed had settled into a rhythm, rising before dawn and returning to camp after sunset, exhausted but satisfied with the dollar amount accumulating in his pay envelope. Delaney proved a knowledgeable partner, teaching Jed the particulars of railroad scouting, how to identify ground stable enough for tracks, how to estimate the amount of blasting powder needed for cutting through ridges, how to spot natural features that might cause problems during construction. "You're a quick study," Delaney observed. "Most new men take weeks to learn what you've picked up in days." Back at camp, Jed kept to himself, avoiding the card games and whiskey that claim most men's wages before they were earned. Instead, he spent evenings studying Ellis's son's architectural drawings, imagining how the planned buildings might be adapted to their needs once he returned. On the seventh day, everything changed. They were 15 miles from camp, surveying a narrow canyon that might serve as a natural passage through a line of low hills, when Delaney suddenly stiffened in his saddle. "Don't move," he whispered, his gaze fixed on the canyon rim above them. Jed followed his line of sight and saw them, 3 mounted Apache warriors silhouetted against the sky, observing them with unnerving stillness. "What do we do?" Jed asked, keeping his voice low and his hand away from Ellis's revolver. "We leave. Slowly." Delaney turned his horse unhurriedly. "Don't run. Don't look scared. Just ride away like we've finished our business here." They maintained a deliberate pace until they cleared the canyon mouth, then increased speed to a steady trot. The warriors followed, keeping pace along the ridge. "Are they going to attack?" Jed asked, acutely aware of their vulnerability. "If they wanted us dead, we'd already be breathing our last," Delaney replied grimly. "More likely they're escorting us out of their territory, but if we make a wrong move..." For 3 tense miles, the silent escort continued. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the warriors vanished over the ridgeline. "That was a warning," Delaney said once they were clearly alone. "Railroads pushing too far into their hunting grounds won't be the last confrontation." They reported the encounter to Harkins, who merely nodded and marked the location on his map. "Expect more of the same in the coming days. Commission pays extra for hazardous conditions. $1 a day more for both of you." Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Ellis faced challenges of his own. The day after Jed's departure, Grayson appeared with Marshal Wallace and a document bearing the county judge's seal. "Inspection order," Grayson announced smugly, "authorizing me to examine the cattle pending our court hearing." Wallace looked uncomfortable. "Sorry, Ellis. Judge Patterson signed it before I could speak with him." Ellis had no choice but to permit the inspection. Grayson meticulously counted and assessed each animal, making notes in a leather-bound ledger. 11 head plus calves, he concluded. Current market value approximately $30 each, plus premium for the bull. I'll expect them delivered to the bank's holding pens after the court hearing. "You're mighty confident for a man with no legal claim," Ellis retorted. Grayson smiled thinly. "Unfortunate about your documentation. So easy for papers to get lost in a fire." "I have copies," Ellis bluffed, though in truth only Holcomb possessed duplicates now. "We'll see what the judge says," Grayson replied, mounting his horse. "I'm a patient man, Hargrove. I can wait another week to collect what's rightfully mine." After they departed, Thomas Holloway emerged from the cabin where he'd been instructed to hide during the inspection. "What are we going to do, Mr. Hargrove?" "We're going to survive," Ellis answered simply, though worry lined his weathered face. The next day brought unexpected developments. Mrs. Holloway arrived with a wagon containing building supplies and 3 strong men. "Thomas tells me you're rebuilding," she said briskly. "These gentlemen owed my late husband for blacksmith work. They're paying their debt by helping you." Ellis was suspicious of such generosity. "This is mighty kind, ma'am, but why would you invest in a ranch that might be lost to the bank in a week?" Mrs. Holloway's gaze was direct. "Because I believe in investing in people, Mr. Hargrove. I've watched Mr. Morgan transform a ruin into a promising homestead through sheer determination. Men like that are rare in these parts." With this unexpected help, construction progressed rapidly. By the time 2 weeks had passed, a new, sturdier cabin stood where the temporary shelter had been, and work had begun on rebuilding the corral to its former size. Back on the railroad survey, Jed and Delaney continued their dangerous work. Twice more they encountered Apache warriors, and once narrowly escaped a flash flood that swept through a gully minutes after they'd crossed it. The constant peril made the days blur together, but the growing sum in Jed's pay envelope made each risk worthwhile. On what should have been his final day before returning home, disaster struck. While crossing a scree slope, Delaney's horse lost its footing. Man and beast tumbled 30 feet down the rocky incline, the horse breaking a leg in the fall, and Delaney suffering a compound fracture of his arm. Jed fashioned a splint from branches and his own shirt, but Delaney needed proper medical attention. "Go for help," the Irishman urged through gritted teeth. "I'll manage till you return." "I'm not leaving you here," Jed insisted, remembering their Apache encounters. Instead, he helped Delaney onto Copper, then mercifully ended the suffering of the injured horse with Ellis's revolver. Leading Copper by the reins, Jed began the long walk back to camp, supporting his injured companion and keeping watch for threats human or natural. They'd traveled barely a mile when hoofbeats approached from behind. Jed drew the revolver, prepared to defend them both, but it was a party of railroad men led by Harkins himself. "Heard the shot," the foreman explained. "Figured someone might be in trouble." As they returned to camp and the company doctor set Delaney's broken arm, Harkins took Jed aside. "Need you to stay on another week. Double pay. Delaney's out, and you know the territory now." Jed thought of Ellis alone at the ranch, of their approaching court date, of the cattle vulnerable to Grayson's schemes, but he also thought of the additional money, enough to purchase lumber for a proper barn, seeds for spring planting, perhaps even another horse or two. "Can't do a week," he countered. 3 days, then I have to return. Court business." Harkins considered briefly. 3 days at triple rate. Need that canyon route surveyed properly." "Deal," Jed agreed, knowing Ellis would understand the delay when he saw the additional funds. What neither man could know was that back at the ranch, events were unfolding that would render their careful plans meaningless. As a winter storm gathered on the horizon, Ellis Hargrove faced a threat far more dangerous than Grayson's legal maneuvers, a threat to everything he and Jed had built from that single silver dollar investment. The storm that had been threatening for days finally broke over Ellis's head with savage intensity. Snow fell in blinding sheets, driven by winds that howled like hungry wolves. Within hours, drifts had formed against the newly constructed cabin, and the temperature plummeted to levels that threatened man and beast alike. Ellis worked tirelessly, moving the cattle into the sheltered area behind the cabin and covering them with canvas salvaged from the burned stable. Emperor, usually dominant and difficult, stood docile as the old man secured a makeshift blanket over his massive frame. "Just like your sire," Ellis muttered, patting the bull's flank. "Ornery as sin until real trouble comes, then solid as bedrock." By nightfall, the blizzard had intensified beyond anything Ellis had seen in decades. He alternated between tending the fire in the cabin and checking the cattle, fighting through snow that reached his thighs. During one such trip, he spotted movement near the property's edge, darker shapes moving against the white backdrop. Wolves. The harsh weather had driven them down from the high country, desperate and hungry. Ellis counted 5 sets of eyes reflecting the dim light from his lantern. Under normal circumstances, wolves avoided human settlements, but starvation changed the calculations of predator and prey alike. The cattle, sensing danger, huddled closer together, their breath forming cloudy plumes in the frozen air. Inside the cabin, Ellis retrieved the Winchester, loaded it methodically, then returned to stand guard. The wolves maintained their distance, but their intent was clear. They were assessing the situation, looking for weakness, waiting for an opportunity. "You picked the wrong herd," Ellis told them, firing a warning shot that sent them temporarily scattering. But they didn't go far. Throughout the night, they circled, their howls carrying on the wind. Ellis remained vigilant, catching moments of rest on a chair positioned to watch both the cattle and the cabin's single window. By dawn, the old rancher's stamina was flagging, his arthritic joints protesting from cold and constant motion. The blizzard continued unabated into the second day. Ellis's firewood supply dwindled alarmingly. They'd been rebuilding too quickly to properly stockpile for winter. More pressing was his concern for the cattle. The makeshift shelter was inadequate against such extreme conditions, and he spotted worrying signs of distress in two of the younger cows. Mid-morning brought unexpected hope. Thomas Holloway appeared like an apparition through the swirling snow, leading a mule laden with firewood. "Ma sent me to check on you," the boy explained, his face red with cold beneath his scarf. "Said she had a feeling trouble was brewing." Ellis could have wept with gratitude. "Your mother's intuition might have saved lives today, lad." Together they reinforced the cattle shelter, distributed the precious firewood, and took turns watching for the wolf pack. Thomas proved surprisingly capable, handling the Winchester with the ease of someone raised on the frontier. "Pa taught me before he passed," the boy explained. "Ma made sure I kept practicing." The storm raged through that day and into the next. Ellis felt himself weakening. A persistent cough had settled in his chest, and his movements became slower, more labored. Thomas noticed. "You need rest, Mr. Hargrove. I'll watch the herd." "Can't ask that of you, son. Your mother would skin me alive if anything happened." "Nothing's going to happen," Thomas insisted with youthful confidence. "The wolves haven't been back since yesterday." Reluctantly, Ellis retreated to his bunk. Extracting a promise from Thomas to wake him at the first sign of trouble, sleep claimed him instantly, his body surrendering to exhaustion. He awakened to gunshots and Thomas's frantic voice. "Mr. Hargrove, they're back, and they've got one of the heifers." Ellis stumbled outside, Winchester in hand, to find chaos in the darkness. The wolf pack had returned in greater numbers, 8 or 9 now, and had somehow separated a young heifer from the herd. The animal bellowed in terror as wolves harried it from all sides. Thomas had positioned himself between the wolves and the main herd, firing carefully placed shots to drive them back without hitting the panicked heifer. Ellis joined him, and together they created enough threat to make the wolves retreat, dragging the injured heifer with them into the swirling snow. "We lost her," Thomas said, voice breaking. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hargrove. I should have been more alert." "You did well, son," Ellis assured him, though the loss cut deep. Every animal represented not just monetary value, but the future he and Jed were building. Could have been much worse. The wolves, having tasted success, would return. Ellis knew it with the certainty born of decades on the frontier. The question was whether their remaining defenses would be enough. Meanwhile, Jed's extended railroad work had proven even more dangerous than anticipated. The canyon they were surveying showed evidence of recent Apache presence, fresh tracks, still warm campfire ashes. Harkins insisted they continue despite the risks. "Company's paying triple for this route," the foreman reminded him. "Worth a little danger." On the second day, disaster struck. A rock slide, either natural or deliberately triggered, caught their 4-man party in the narrowest section of the canyon. 2 surveyors were crushed instantly. Jed and Harkins barely escaped, their horses wild with terror. "Ambush!" Harkins gasped as they took shelter behind a boulder. "They've been watching us." Jed peered over their meager cover to see mounted figures on the ridgeline, at least a dozen warriors armed with rifles alongside traditional weapons. Their position was untenable. "We need to move," Jed urged. "They have the high ground. We're target practice here." "Can't outrun them in open country," Harkins countered. "Don't need to outrun them. Just need to reach that stand of trees." Jed pointed to a dense copse about a quarter-mile distant. "Better cover, and I noticed caves there yesterday." They made their break during a lull in the Apache fire, riding hard for the trees. Bullets kicked up dirt around them, but they reached the shelter of the pines without taking hits. The caves Jed had spotted provided perfect defensive positions, narrow entrances that could be guarded, with depths that offered protection from gunfire. Harkins looked at Jed with newfound respect. "You've got good instincts, Morgan. Most men would have panicked." "Save your praise for when we're back at camp," Jed replied grimly. "We're still a long way from safe." They spent a harrowing night in the cave, taking turns standing watch. By dawn, the Apache had disappeared, but Jed suspected they were simply waiting in more advantageous positions. He and Harkins faced an impossible choice: remain in relative safety with dwindling supplies, or attempt to return to camp across exposed terrain. The decision was made for them when Harkins developed a fever from a wound Jed hadn't noticed in the chaos. A bullet had grazed the foreman's side, and the injury was now infected. "You need to go for help," Harkins insisted through chattering teeth. "I'll slow you down too much." Jed thought of Ellis alone at the ranch, of their court date now just days away, of the promises he'd made, but he couldn't abandon a wounded man to certain death. "We go together," he said firmly, "or not at all." As Jed improvised a travois to transport the feverish Harkins, he was unaware that back at the ranch the wolf pack had returned in strength, and this time they had managed to corner Ellis alone in the cattle shelter, far from his rifle and with night rapidly falling across the snow-covered land. Ellis had gone to check the water trough when he spotted fresh wolf tracks circling the cattle shelter. He'd left his Winchester in the cabin, a critical error. Before he could retreat, 3 wolves materialized from the swirling snow, cutting off his path to safety. Emperor bellowed a warning from inside the shelter, sensing the danger to his herd. Ellis backed slowly toward the cattle, keeping his eyes on the predators. His only weapon was a pitchfork he'd been using to distribute hay. The wolves advanced cautiously, hunger overcoming their natural caution around humans. "Come on then," Ellis growled, brandishing the pitchfork. "I'm old, but I'm not easy meat." The lead wolf, a massive gray with battle-scarred ears, lunged first. Ellis caught it mid-leap with the pitchfork tines, the force of the impact driving him back against the shelter wall. The wounded animal retreated, yelping, but the other 2 circled closer. Inside the shelter, the cattle grew increasingly agitated. Emperor slammed his massive bulk against the wooden partition, rattling the entire structure. Ellis realized what was about to happen seconds before the bull broke through, charging into the open with lowered horns. The wolves scattered before Emperor's fury. The bull positioned himself between Ellis and the predators, pawing the snowy ground and snorting clouds of steam into the frigid air. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but rifle shots cracked through the storm. Thomas Holloway, returning from checking boundary fences, had spotted the confrontation. The boy fired with precision, dropping one wolf and sending the others fleeing into the blizzard. "Mr. Hargrove!" Thomas rushed forward, helping Ellis to his feet. "Are you hurt?" "Just my pride," Ellis wheezed, his breath coming in labored gasps. The exertion had aggravated his cough. "And my judgment. Never should have left the rifle behind." They coaxed Emperor back into the shelter, the bull still agitated, but responding to Ellis's familiar voice. Inside the cabin, Thomas insisted on examining the older man for injuries. "You're burning with fever," he declared, feeling Ellis's forehead. "You need medicine and proper rest." "What I need is for Morgan to get back," Ellis muttered, though he didn't resist when Thomas helped him to his bunk. "Court date's 3 days from now." If we don't show, Grayson wins by default. The boy's face grew serious. The storm's supposed to break tomorrow. I'll ride to Preston's Crossing for medicine, then to the railroad camp to find Mr. Morgan. Too dangerous, Ellis protested weakly. Your mother would never forgive me. My mother's the one who taught me to stand by my friends, Thomas replied with quiet determination. Rest now. I'll watch for the wolves. By dawn, Ellis's condition had deteriorated. His breathing was shallow, his cough deep and wet. Thomas waited until first light, then prepared for his journey. I've left water and food within reach, he told Ellis. The fire's built up and should last until midday. I'll be back with help as soon as possible. Ellis gripped the boy's arm with surprising strength. If you find Morgan, tell him. He hesitated, unaccustomed to expressing sentiment. Tell him it was a good partnership. Tell him yourself when he gets here, Thomas responded firmly. Meanwhile, Jed faced his own desperate situation. The makeshift travois he'd constructed for Harkins had slowed their progress to a crawl. The foreman's fever had worsened overnight, and he drifted in and out of consciousness. Leave me, Harkins insisted during a moment of lucidity. Save yourself. Not happening, Jed replied, checking the horizon for pursuers. The Apache hadn't shown themselves since the initial attack, which worried him more than if they'd been actively hunting the survivors. Such patience usually meant they were waiting for something, perhaps nightfall, or for the white men to reach a particular location ideal for ambush. They had traveled barely 2 miles when Copper suddenly tensed, ears forward. Jed reached for Ellis's revolver, but what emerged from behind a rock outcropping wasn't an Apache warrior. It was a cavalry patrol. You boys look like you've seen better days, the lieutenant in charge observed, quickly assessing the situation. Cooper's survey crew? What's left of it, Jed confirmed. Apache ambush in the canyon yesterday. 2 men dead. Harkins here took a bullet. The patrol's medic examined Harkins while the lieutenant questioned Jed about the attack. They'd been sent to escort the survey crew after reports of increased Apache activity in the region. You're lucky we found you, the lieutenant said. This area's crawling with war parties. Railroads pushing too far into their territory too fast. With military escort, they reached the railroad camp by midday. The company doctor took charge of Harkins, giving him a fighting chance at survival. The lieutenant informed Jed that all survey work had been suspended pending negotiations with the Apache leadership. Means you're out of a job, I'm afraid, he said. But you'll get full pay for your contracted time, plus hazard bonus. Jed collected his wages, more money than he'd seen at one time in his life, and prepared to depart immediately for home. The court date was approaching, and he'd already been gone longer than planned. As he saddled Copper, a commotion at the camp perimeter caught his attention. A rider had arrived, a boy on an exhausted mule. Jed recognized Thomas Holloway, snow-covered and half-frozen. Morgan, Thomas called, spotting him. Thank God. The boy's news hit Jed like a physical blow. Ellis gravely ill, wolves threatening the herd, and the court hearing just days away. Each problem alone was significant. Together, they seemed insurmountable. I need a fresh horse, Jed told the lieutenant, and medical supplies. Take what you need, the officer replied, recognizing the urgency. I can spare 2 men to ride with you if there's trouble. Much obliged, but we'll travel faster alone. Jed transferred his gear to a sturdy cavalry mount, allowing Copper time to recover. Thomas, eat something hot while I prepare. We ride in 20 minutes. They departed at a gallop, pushing hard through terrain still treacherous from recent snowfall. Thomas had confirmed that the storm had finally broken, but the boy's expression remained grave. There's something else you should know, he said as they rode. I passed through Preston's Crossing for medicine. Overheard Grayson and some men at the saloon. They were planning to visit your place today. said something about resolving the cattle situation before the judge could hear the case. A cold fury settled in Jed's chest. Rustling. He's going to steal what he couldn't take legally. There were at least 6 men with him, Thomas warned. All armed. Jed checked Ellis's revolver and the cavalry rifle he'd been provided. Then we'd better hurry. They rode without stopping, reaching the ranch by late afternoon. From a ridge overlooking the property, Jed surveyed the situation through field glasses borrowed from the cavalry. His heart sank. 5 riders were driving their cattle away from the cabin, toward the road to town. No sign of Ellis. The cabin door was closed, smoke rising normally from the chimney. "Wait here," Jed instructed Thomas. "If I'm not back in an hour, ride for the marshal." "I'm coming with you," the boy insisted. "Mr. Hargrove needs his medicine." Jed recognized the determined set of Thomas's jaw. Arguing would waste precious time. "Stay behind me then, and if shooting starts, you get to the cabin and stay there." As they descended toward the confrontation that would determine the fate of everything Jed had built from his $1 investment, he thought of Ellis's words from months ago. First rule of ranching, always help a neighbor get started. 'Cause someday, you'll be the one needing help. Today, it seemed, was that day. Jed and Thomas approached cautiously, using a dry creek bed for cover. As they drew closer, voices carried on the cold air. "Grayson wants all of them, especially that bull," one rustler directed. "Says it's evidence of fraud or some such nonsense." "Seems like a lot of trouble for 11 head of cattle," another complained. "Especially with a blizzard barely cleared." "Ain't about the cattle," a third man laughed. "It's about breaking that drifter who thought he could waltz in and set up ranching. Grayson says he needs a lesson in how business works in these parts." Jed motioned for Thomas to remain hidden, then crept forward to a position behind a cluster of boulders. From there, he could see the full situation. 5 men on horseback herding their cattle toward the main road, while a 6th, Grayson himself, sat on his horse supervising the operation. The cattle moved sluggishly, still weakened from the storm and reluctant to leave their shelter. Emperor was particularly resistant, repeatedly turning back toward the cabin. 2 rustlers struggled to drive him forward, cursing the massive bull's stubbornness. Jed considered his options. 6 armed men against 1 presented poor odds, even with surprise on his side. A direct confrontation would likely end badly and could put Thomas at risk. Yet watching them steal the cattle, the foundation of everything he and Ellis had built, was unthinkable. His decision came when Emperor finally lost patience with his tormentors. The bull suddenly charged one rustler's horse, causing the animal to rear in panic, throwing its rider. The momentary chaos was the opening Jed needed. Standing, he fired the cavalry rifle into the air. "That's far enough," he shouted, voice carrying across the snowy landscape. "The next shot won't be a warning." The rustlers froze, hands instinctively moving toward their weapons. Grayson squinted against the setting sun, trying to identify the challenger. "Morgan?" he called. "Is that you? Where's the old man? Finally died and left you his worthless cattle." "Ellis is fine," Jed lied, keeping the rifle steady. "And those cattle aren't going anywhere." Grayson laughed, clearly counting the odds in his favor. "There's 6 of us and 1 of you. Simple arithmetic suggests you're at a disadvantage." "Count again," came a new voice from the opposite ridge. Marshal Wallace sat his horse there, flanked by 4 townsmen, including Tucker from the livery. All were armed. The marshal rode down slowly, rifle resting across his saddle. "Interesting situation we have here, Mr. Grayson. Looks remarkably like cattle rustling, which is still a hanging offense in this territory." "These cattle are bank property," Grayson insisted, though sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold. "I'm merely recovering collateral from a delinquent loan." "Funny thing," Wallace replied. Judge Patterson sent a telegram yesterday clarifying that no seizure of livestock should occur until after the hearing. I was just on my way to inform you. He gestured toward the rustlers. Tell your men to move away from those cattle. For a tense moment it seemed Grayson might resist. Then reality asserted itself. He was outmanned and caught in an indefensible position. With visible reluctance, he ordered his men to withdraw. This isn't over, Morgan, he spat as they departed. The court will still rule in the bank's favor. We'll see about that, Jed replied, already turning his attention to more urgent matters. Thomas, get that medicine to Ellis, now. Inside the cabin, they found Ellis barely conscious, his breathing labored and skin burning with fever. The medicine Thomas had brought, laudanum for pain and a tincture of willow bark for fever, offered temporary relief at best. What Ellis needed was a doctor. Marshal, Jed asked, how fast can we get the doctor from Sterling? 3 days round trip in these conditions, Wallace replied grimly. And that's if he's available. He won't last 3 days, Thomas said quietly, voicing what they all feared. An unexpected voice joined the conversation. I might be able to help. Mrs. Holloway stood in the doorway, her practical skirts dusted with snow. I've nursed many through winter ailments, including my Thomas through pneumonia 2 years back. She moved to Ellis's bedside with confident efficiency, examining his chest and listening to his breathing. Lung infection, as I suspected. We need to clear the congestion and break the fever. From her basket, she produced vials and packets that she immediately began preparing into poultices and teas. Thomas, heat water. Mr. Morgan, we need steam. Pine needles boiled in water would be best. Marshal, I'll need clean cloths, as many as you can find. Under her direction, they worked through the night. Ellis's fever broke near dawn, his breathing easing as the poultices drew infection from his lungs. By mid-morning, he was awake and taking broth, weak but unmistakably improving. You've got more lives than a canyon cat, Jed told him, relief evident in his voice. Too stubborn to die, Ellis rasped, especially with unfinished business. His eyes moved to the window, where Emperor could be seen standing protectively near the recovering herd. They're all safe? Everyone, Jed confirmed, and Grayson's rustling attempt backfired. The marshal witnessed it all. Should make tomorrow's court hearing interesting. The hearing itself proved anticlimactic. Lawyer Holcomb presented Ellis's original loan documentation, clearly showing no claim on livestock. Judge Patterson, already displeased by reports of Grayson's attempted rustling, ruled decisively in their favor. More surprising was the announcement that followed. Furthermore, the judge declared, evidence has been presented of Mr. Grayson's involvement in the arson of Mr. Morgan's stable, as well as his attempt to illegally seize livestock before this court's ruling. Mr. Grayson is hereby relieved of his position at First Territorial Bank, and charges of criminal conspiracy will be considered by the grand jury next month. Grayson, pale and sweating, was escorted from the courtroom by Marshal Wallace. The bank's regional manager, hastily summoned from Denver, approached Jed and Ellis afterward. Gentlemen, the bank deeply regrets Mr. Grayson's actions, he said smoothly. As compensation for your losses, we're prepared to offer adjoining land, 50 acres connecting your current property to the water rights on Cooper Creek, at a nominal fee. How nominal? Jed asked cautiously. $1, the manager replied with a thin smile. The bank wishes this unfortunate business concluded as quickly and quietly as possible. 1 week later, Jed stood on the ridge overlooking what was now a 60-acre ranch. Below, construction had begun on a proper barn, built according to the plans Ellis's son had drawn years ago. The cabin, though small, had weathered the winter storms. The cattle grazed peacefully in the lower meadow, including 2 new calves born during the recent thaw. Ellis joined him, moving slowly but steadily, his health improving daily under Mrs. Holloway's continued care. "Not bad for a $1 investment," the old rancher observed, surveying the scene. $2 now, Jed corrected, gesturing toward the newly acquired acreage. "Might be the best money I ever spent." "What will you call it?" Ellis asked. "Property needs a name if it's going to be a real ranch." Jed considered the question. He thought of the abandoned stable he'd purchased months ago, of the silver dollar that had changed hands, of the fire that had nearly destroyed everything, and of the partnerships, with Ellis, with the Holloways, with the community, that had ultimately saved it all. Silver Dollar, he decided. The Silver Dollar Ranch. Ellis nodded approval. Fitting. Below them, a wagon approached carrying lumber for the barn. Thomas Holloway drove the team, his mother beside him. Behind them rode Tucker and 2 other men from town, coming to help with the day's construction. The railroad company, grateful for Jed's heroism during the Apache attack, had contributed building materials and promised to purchase beef from the ranch once production increased. "You know," Ellis said thoughtfully, "my son would have appreciated seeing his designs finally built." He gazed at the partially constructed barn. He always said a man needs to build something that outlasts him. "We're building it," Jed replied, "together." As spring sunshine warmed the awakening land, Jed reflected on the journey that had brought him here. 6 months ago, he'd been a drifter with nothing but a horse and a single silver dollar to his name. Now he owned land, cattle, and a future, all because he'd seen possibility in an abandoned stable that others had dismissed as worthless. Emperor's distinctive bellow carried from the meadow where the massive bull kept watch over his growing herd. Soon there would be crops to plant, fences to mend, markets to establish. The work ahead was daunting but no longer overwhelming. Each challenge now came with the knowledge that he didn't face it alone. Mrs. Holloway's wagon stopped at the cabin, and she waved up at them. Though she maintained a proper distance, her interest in Jed's welfare had deepened into something neither of them had yet named, but both increasingly acknowledged. Thomas had already proven himself an eager student of ranching, absorbing Ellis's decades of knowledge with remarkable aptitude. "Partnerships," Ellis mused as if reading Jed's thoughts. "That's what builds a country. Not just one man against the wilderness, but people standing together." He gestured toward the activity below. "This is how the West is really won." Jed nodded, understanding now what his father had never learned in a lifetime of working other men's land. True wealth wasn't just in acres or cattle or dollars. It was in creating something of value where nothing had existed before. It was in the connections formed with people who became more than neighbors, more than business associates. It was in transforming an abandoned stable into the foundation of a legacy. As they descended the ridge to join the others, Jed carried with him the satisfaction of knowing his $1 investment had yielded returns beyond any banker's calculations. The Silver Dollar Ranch stood as testament to what determination, partnership, and faith in possibility could achieve, even when starting with nothing more than a weathered stable and a single silver coin.